Okay, hi guys, it's Miss Laura again. So the last great lesson that we did left off with the earth being formed. So we had kind of gotten water and we said that conditions were just right for life to develop. So the second great lesson that we're going to do today is the coming of life. Now there are many different kinds of life on earth. So many. And what I have here is my timeline of life that shows the evolution, the changing of life over just millions and millions of years. So we're going to start all the way over here at the very beginning. There are many different kinds of life on Earth. There are amoebas, and there are dinoflagellates. Dinoflagellates are these tiny little microscopic creatures that move around with two little whips. That's how they move themselves through the water. There are sponges. These developed so early and we still have them today. In fact, when you use a sponge in the shower, most of them now are made of like some kind of plasticky material, but sometimes you can get real dried sponges that people use in the shower. There were trilobites. Trilobites were a big part of life for a long time. They moved around eating and making more and more of themselves, and some of them became very big. They were a little bit like lobsters today, but there aren't any trilobites anymore. They went extinct a long time ago. I'm going to put them here. And maybe you can see, if you follow this red line, how long trilobites lived. A very long time. As time went on, all kinds of different animals appeared. This is a really interesting one I'm going to show you. It's called a cephalopod. And there are still cephalopods today. You know what's really cool about them is that their heads are attached to their feet. So their feet, and this is their head. Isn't that crazy? They go down here. But there are still cephalopods today. One kind of creature looked like a flower attached to its stalk. You see here? It looks like a stalk with a feathery flower on it. It's called a crinoid. They were not flowers at all, actually. They had the name sea lilies, so crinoids, sometimes people call them sea lilies. But what they did is they made a kind of stone, a stone house to protect themselves because they were soft and jelly-like. They go right here. When they died, they dried up and their little stone houses collapsed and fell to the bottom of the sea. These feathery parts here moved the water around them, and then using those feathery bits, they would catch little tiny particles to eat. So that's how they ate. The sea was full of all types of life. But there was one kind of life that would not eat what the others ate. What it did was make food out of the salts and this is crazy, the sunlight. Actually took the energy right out of the sunlight. Some of them lived in the sea near the land. The tides would carry them onto the land, and then they would stay there for a while until the tides carried them back home. The air was full of gas, carbon dioxide, that helped them to make their own food so that they were able to make the food they needed while they were on land. And maybe some of you can guess where this is going and what these creatures developed into. Some of them eventually stayed on land, and when they died, their bodies were left to prepare the ground for others to come. Life was trying out land to see what it was like, and this kind of life developed into plants. This is one of the earliest plants. It's called a liverwort. I'm gonna put it right here in the Ordovician era. But maybe you can go along here and show all the different plants that evolved. over millions and millions of years. That all started here, and actually it's related to seaweed and algae, which started earlier. But that's not the end of the story. While all of this was going on, two new types of animals appeared. One was helping to build more land, and that was the coral. Corals would attach themselves to land and kind of build up and become land themselves. That goes right here. The other animal, it was an animal, and it had a rod inside its body. It's the first time that it happened. Until now, all the animals who had some hard part on their body had shells on the outside, like the Trilobite or the Cephalopod. Those had shells on the outside. This had something on the inside. From the very beginning, from this beginning, animals later developed bones, and now we call those animals vertebrates. They've got a vertebrae. Got to move down a little bit here. All right. Slowly, some of these creatures with rods, long story, I lost my place. Some of these creatures with rods developed into fish, and a great variety of fish developed. This is one of my favorites. Some grew very big and had armor. This one is called a Dunkleosteus. Please don't judge me if I got that one wrong. But it's a big, huge armored fish, and you know what it would do? Some of them would bury themselves in the mud for protection. Well, probably this kind wouldn't, other kinds would. They had all different ways that the fish would live in the ocean. Others swam really fast. But that is still not the end of the story. Still got a long way to go. Slowly, over a period of time, with all that coral and all the plants preparing the earth, the land rose up. Here and there, it closed off some of the seas. And in some places where there was little or even no rain, the water began to dry up. Now, if you need water for life and the water dries up, what do? Well, you either die, not a great choice, or you figure out a way to go on living. So these creatures figured out a way to go on living. Now, did they really think, let's figure out a way to go on living? Not really, but it's fun to think about it that way. Okay, so fish were trapped in some places and they had to find a way to live. So some decided, I'm going to have a sac inside my body and it's going to be lined with moisture, and with that, I'm going to be able to breathe. I won't need the water anymore. And so they developed a way to breathe outside of the water. These animals lived partly in water and partly on land. Does anyone, well, you guys aren't going to be able to answer me because you're not here in person. You might be able to guess that these are amphibians, the very first amphibians. Here's an amphibian here, and this amphibian has developed little feet so it can crawl out of the water and then go back in. Their fins became useless, and so they changed into legs. The amphibians were animals like salamanders and frogs, and you guys know we still have amphibians, all kinds of them. Now with them came one of the first voices that was heard on Earth, because until then, there hadn't been other animals on land that could make sounds. But now that silence was broken by the voice of amphibians, and also developed around this time, insects, which was handy because amphibians, many of them eat insects. So convenient. So in the meantime, more and more plants appeared. They grew very fast and in great variety. So the amphibians had plenty to eat between the plants and the insects. There was one little problem though. Because of the way their skin was made, it had to be wet all the time, most of the time. And so they had to stay near water. They also had to lay their eggs in the water. Now, sometimes you don't even have that much water around, so you have to develop into something else. if the animals ventured further inland, they needed to develop a skin that would not dry out, not even under the sun. And they needed to protect their eggs with a hard shell covering instead of having them be in water. So a new kind of animal came out of these changes, and it is the reptile. You might notice that I have a different color here now. That's because I've moved out of the Paleozoic era and into the Mesozoic era. I'm going to put my first reptile down here. There he is. And these are just ways that we measure time when we're talking about the history of the earth and the history of life. With this new kind of skin and egg protection, these animals could move freely around the land. They could live with land all around them. They lived amongst tall plants and they ate insects. Now these reptiles became almost like lords and masters of the earth. They took over the land. They grew and grew. They had huge bones to support huge bodies and huge muscles. And they grew to enormous size until they became animals like this that you might recognize. Dinosaurs. Put this down here. One of these creatures was so long, one of these dinosaurs was so long that it even had a second brain sitting right where the tail begins, so that it could feel a bite if some animal should come up and bite its tail. They were huge, huge creatures. Well, these reptiles walked the earth, and they fed upon its plants and other small animals, and the other small animals had very little chance to go on living because they couldn't get enough food. So, the other animals went to areas where reptiles could not go. They moved to colder regions. There were fewer plants in these areas, but smaller animals didn't need as much to eat. However, they had to protect themselves from the cold, so what developed was feathers and fur and warm blood. These animals were birds and mammals. Here's a picture of an early mammal that developed. Put it right here. What about eggs? Well, it was so cold that mammals actually kept their eggs inside of their bodies to keep them warm. That's pretty genius. Birds couldn't do that. If they did, they'd be too heavy to fly. So they built nests, and they sat on top of their eggs to keep them warm. When the little ones hatched, the parent birds fed them and guarded them. And when the baby mammals were born, their parents took care of them and their mothers fed them their milk. This was new because most reptiles didn't do this. Not all. There were some that did take care of their young, but it was not as common as it was with mammals and birds. This is still not the end of the story. By the time the new animals arrived, the weather had changed on Earth. There was a huge change in weather. It had gotten very, 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 very cold. And the reptiles, without fur, without feathers, without warm blood, they could not stand it, and so they began to die out. So what do you think happened? What happened, gotta move down here, is that the birds and the mammals took over. There were many kinds of birds. This one I think is really cool. It's a huge bird that's flightless. It can't fly. Goes right here. And here's another one of those early mammals. I'm gonna put it right here. Well, the mammals and birds kept spreading out over the whole earth. Here's another mammal that was a little bit later. You can tell because look how big that is. Had to have some time to develop into something like that, right? That's a mastodon. That's still not quite the end of the story, even though we're almost to the end of our timeline. Something very exciting happened for us. towards the end of that very cold time, a new type of being came to it. It didn't have heavy fur and it didn't have long, sharp teeth, but what it did have was a large brain and the power to think and imagine. And it had hands with opposable thumbs. That was different. And this being was not the same. It was the same in many ways, but there are some differences between other animals. And that is important to us because it's the same thing that we are. It's the human being. I'll put this right here. Early humans. Now, elementary 2, we're going to learn so much about early humans this year. That's what you're going to learn about all year in history, and it's going to be awesome. That's where we are as far as how life has evolved. It would be so interesting if we could see where we were going next as a planet with life. But we will continue our story of how our world came to be the way it was next time when we talk about the coming of humans in more detail. Bye, guys.